Hello and welcome to the Pagan Portal Podcast, produced by Moonbooks Publishing and presented by me, Rachel Patterson. If you prefer an audio-only version, hop on over to Spotify. If you would like to sign up for early showings of all our goodies, then please do consider subscribing. And please do hit the subscribe button on YouTube. So we have a returning guest today, and it is always a pleasure and fascinating to chat with the wonderful, the legendary best-selling Moonbooks author, expert in the fair folk, Celtic and Norse pathways, and any number of other things. Welcome, Morgan Daimler.
Thank you for having me back on. It's always fun to chat with you.
Now, most people will know you. If they don't, they've been under a rock somewhere. But would you just like to give us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Morgan Daimler. I have been a witch since the early 1990s. I have been studying mythology and folklore for about that same amount of time, less officially, and then more recently have gotten into it in a more direct and academic sort of way. I write books, as you mentioned, mostly about fairies, Irish mythology, and Irish folklore, and kind of anything related to that. And I've also sort of unintentionally in the last several years gotten into studying the intersection between modern fiction and belief. So a little bit of everything.
That's what makes life interesting.
That's my motto.
Now, you have 2 new books coming out with Moonbooks this year. If we can start with Pantheon the Irish. Now, this does sound a really silly question given the title, but what's the idea behind this one?
So Pantheon the Irish is either the 3rd or 4th book in a Moonbooks series called Pantheon. And the vision for it was to sort of offer a range of culturally specific books that would give readers a solid introduction to that pantheon and to sort of the pagan spiritual practices associated with it. So the first half of the book is talking about the culture I'm focused on, in this case, Irish. I've also written a previous one on the Norse. So the first part is focusing on the history of the culture it's from, the spirituality and the religion of the culture it's from. And then the second half is looking at the pantheon itself, sort of the range of gods that we know about, and also some adjacent spirits that are kind of not exactly gods necessarily, but similar.
We'll come on to those. Now, I need to get the usual question out of the way first. Celtic or Irish? What's the difference? What's the clarification on that?
So, Celtic, I usually will say Celtic language speaking cultures just because it's a little more specific, but Celtic is kind of a broad blanket term for a group of related cultures that share sort of the same root language and original root culture if you go way, way back. Whereas Irish would be one of those specific cultures. When we're talking about Celtic, we're talking about, generally speaking, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, and sort of what was happening at that point as populations were moving, and there's a lot of things happening back then when it came to this culture. And the original concept of Celtic cultures even was not unified. So when we talk about it today, I think is a little misleading. We get this idea that there was this one big Celtic culture that was just one big thing that moved around, but it was actually always these small groups that shared, again, similar languages and similar art styles and mythology and things like that. And eventually that kind of divided. I am, of course, paraphrasing here, and there are some disagreements among scholars about where it started, where it spread. Yeah, literally everything. So I'm just sort of giving you the most commonly understood version, simplified. And then, of course, you have the Irish culture, which is very specific, and it shares some features with other Celtic language cultures. But it also has things that are unique to that location that we don't find in other places. So it's kind of the difference between something that's very general and very specific.
Yeah, I know it gets confused quite a lot, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, I think what happened is because, particularly in the 1990s, it was sort of a thing. Everything was Celtic. You just called everything Celtic, and sort of mashed everything together. And a lot of times when people were saying Celtic, they were talking about Irish. And I think it created this confusion now, 30, 40 years later, where people just assume that they're kind of direct equivalents, and they're not. So
if we look at the Irish mythology, I know with the Welsh we have the Mabinogi. Is Irish mythology recorded anywhere that
a lot of it is
upon?
So I think this is another of those fun, like, misinformations or urban myths, however you want to call it. Because you will see a lot of people saying we don't know anything about Irish mythology. We don't have any sources. And where this comes from is the fact that all of our written sources were written down by Christians. And that is true. But that doesn't mean that we don't have anything. And particularly the older material was recorded, at least in my opinion, fairly directly. It's not until later when we get to like the 16th, 17th century that we start to see some kind of questionable versions of things happening. But a lot of the older material is pretty straightforward. And they would even say in it, like, they would give you the original story and then add on in the end, but like, oh, but we know, as good Christians that isn't possible. So it's just literally a disclaimer for the bishop. And it wasn't subtle. It wasn't like there was, you have to like really read into it to tease these things out. They were pretty clear. That disclaimer was pretty clear. So we have a decent amount of material. We don't have everything, which as far as I'm aware, is true for pretty much any pagan, European pagan culture. Everything we have will have references to things that we don't have. Just stories that have been lost, things that were common knowledge, they weren't written down at the time, things along those lines. But we do have quite a good amount of it.
Excellent. Yeah, we have really, I guess, the Romans, the monks, they were the ones that wrote things down, weren't they? So we have them to thank for it, really, albeit perhaps a little bit coloured.
And I actually think with the Romans, not that that's my particular focus, because that wasn't really an issue in Ireland per se, but the Roman material I think is trickier because they weren't straightforward about it.
Oh no.
They just sort of incorporated everything and wrote about it through their own lens,
Absolutely, yeah. All with a pinch of salt with them. Or sometimes even hundreds and hundreds of years later, but we have to start somewhere, don't we?
I think, again, circling back to the fact that people have this idea that if it was recorded by Christians, we have to completely throw it out. Because I run this out a lot with fairy beliefs as well. If we did that, we would have nothing.
Right.
To be clear, there would be nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
And like I said, I think this idea that if Christians wrote it, it's completely untrustworthy. We just need to be careful not to, as they say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's definitely a good amount of material that we can clearly see was originally pagan or is even still relayed as pagan. And then again, there's the bishop disclaimer in there.
Got to keep the bishop happy.
And I mean it when I say it's not subtle. Like there's a story of how all the healing herbs on earth were found. And it ends with, it involves several of the Irish gods of healing, because Ireland tends to have sort of a redundancy, not in a bad way, with deities where you have multiple that are associated with a particular thing. So multiple gods of healing, multiple goddesses of war, things along those lines. And the sort of primary god of healing was upset with a situation, very paraphrasing the story, And his daughter was cataloging all of these healing herbs that had grown up out of her brother's grave, and he scatters them all, and says, "This is not knowledge we're meant to have," basically. And literally after that finishes, there's a little addendum to the text that is like, but we know, it was our Lord Jesus Christ who gave us all this knowledge of healing herbs. So like, it's not subtle. You don't need a magnifying glass to find it.
Do we know what the ancient Irish thought about other realms, other worlds?
We do
in any
to
way?
some degree. And again, like we don't have, no one sat down and wrote out, a little treatise on this is what the common people's beliefs are about these things. That would have been useful. That would have been. I'm glad that today we do have things like that, and hopefully they'll survive, 2,000 years from now, help out those future anthropologists and folklorists. So, we have references. Actually, the oldest Irish language story about what we would call fairies in English, but the Aishi, the people of the fairy mountains, talks about that world. And it was basically understood as a very concrete physical realm, but one that could not necessarily be reached by humans intentionally. There's some accidental things that happen, but whereas the people who live there, the people of the Otherworld, have this ability to cross back and forth. Humans tend to either wander in there accidentally or be taken in there. And it was this idea that it was something adjacent to the human world, connected to the human world, but also separated from it.
Oh, it's interesting. I did read somewhere that, I think it might have been a fiction book, that the actual fairy world used to be one and the same with ours. But because we upset them so much by destroying nature, they shifted it. Have you heard that one?
I have. And you're right, that is something that's modern. I haven't run across it in fiction that I know of, although I'm sure it's out there. I have run across it in the more sort of new age end of the scale kind of books. There's this idea that the fairies, the good folk, are sort of cousins to humanity, I guess we could say. That they came first and they're connected to us, but they were more evolved, more powerful, more magical. And when humans, it's a little unclear at what point this would have happened. And if you know anything about human history, you'll understand why it's unclear. But that humans at some point became too violent and too destructive. And so they sort of withdrew from this reality. We actually don't have enough of the older Irish material to know for sure what they believed about that. What we do have is basically just coming from the perspective that there's always been this divide. So there's no, well, to be fair, we don't have an Irish creation myth anyway for anything. We don't have an Irish creation story for how the human world was made. Any of that sort of stuff that has been lost. We have some hints about what it might have been, that you do need a microscope to kind of find in the stories, but we have some hints of stuff. We just don't have the actual full creation story like we find in some other cultures. And everything we do have sort of presupposes that there is this other world that exists adjacent to the human world and has these powerful, what we would call magical beings in it. So we don't really know how that started. And I believe the Welsh is the same as far as I'm aware. There's just an understanding that this is trees exist, rocks exist, and the other world exists is basically how it is.
I can go with, I can roll with that. That's fine by me. Now, you give a ritual structure in your book. Is that a modern idea, or do we know that there were ancient Irish pagan rituals at some point?
Sure, it's a blend of two things. What's in the Pantheon, the Irish book. It's some of it is based on what we do know historically, which is not a lot. And some of that comes from archaeology, some of that comes from texts that we do have that reference different types of rituals. And then some of it is based on modern Irish pagan practice. And those are kind of blended in the book to give some suggestions for how you could approach doing a ritual in that context. Most of what we do have doesn't get into the specific details of exactly how. It's not like a step-by-step guide to this is how you do an Irish pagan ritual. But it gives us sort of the general outline, so we would know that people would gather. There would be some sort of ritual or ceremony, either led by a druid who would have been the priest or priestess of the time, or sometimes nobility like the king would have led certain types of rites. And then there would have been feasting. Feasting was always a really important part of the whole process.
As it should be.
Yes, as it should be. That is definitely something we need to carry forward and continue to do today. Yes. I think we kind of, in modern terms, we tend to look at things as being very separate. So you have monarchy would be one thing, and then, religion and spirituality would be another. Particularly here in the US, because we don't have monarchy here. And actually the closer way to look at it would be to use England for an example, the way the king is the head of the Anglican Church, I believe it is. Church of England. Yes. Obviously, these days that's more of an honorary title, ceremonial sort of thing. But if you kind of look at it through that lens of this is someone who is considered to be the monarch leader of the country, but they have that role in part because they're seen as being approved by the gods, I guess we could say. So there's this older Irish belief that if you are the king or the queen, but primarily the king, you're the king because the goddess of sovereignty has given you that ability, has chosen you. So that you can kind of see, as I say that, how that would tie into the idea of this being someone who could lead spiritual rituals. Yeah, they're literally blessed and chosen by the goddess.
So are there any, we are familiar with the Wheel of the Year, that is the modern idea today. Do some of those come directly from Ireland originally?
To a degree, yes. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to approach this answer. So the modern Wheel of the Year, as we have it, many people probably already know this, was sort of put together in the mid 20th century. And it sort of blends a more Norse holiday schedule with a more generally Celtic, but we'll say Irish in this case, holiday schedule. And that works for a lot of people. So I am not in any way criticizing the modern Wheel of the Year. But 4 of those holidays, what would have been called the fire festivals, seem to have been primarily drawn from Irish culture, maybe also a little bit Scottish at the time. So we have Imbolc, which is February 2nd. February 1st. See, I knew I was going to mess it up as soon as I started to say it. Candlemas is February 2nd. That is the Catholic Saints' Day. The 1st of February, there we go. All of the Irish fire festivals are on the 1st of the calendar month that they're associated with. So it makes them easy to remember unless you're me, and then I managed to mess it up anyway. So the 1st of February is Imbolc, and then we have the 1st of May is Bealtaine. That kind of gets anglicized to Beltane for those that don't recognize the Irish that I'm about to really confuse. Yeah. And then the 1st of August is Lunasa, and then the 1st of November is Samhain, although we tend to celebrate it on the 31st, in modern culture. And that comes from the idea that all of these holidays would have begun the night before, and sort of ties into, this idea we get from some of the older, speaking of Romans, the older Roman material, claiming that the Celts started their day at sunset, basically, and measured days from sunset to sunset instead of, from midnight to midnight or dawn to dawn. So there's this idea, if we're saying the first of the calendar month, you would start that the night before. And that's true for all of them, when we look at like the folk practices.
Remembering the dates was one of the first things that I stumbled on when I was learning many, many years ago.
Yeah.
Remembering all those dates on the wheel.
I was going to say, and of course, the solstices and equinoxes are tricky because they're not on the same day every year. They wander a little bit.
Sent to try us, definitely.
Yeah. Yes. Keeps it interesting.
Definitely. I can remember having charts and things printed out all over the place just to try and remind myself. Is there a specific form of magic that was specific to Irish paganism? Did they believe in? Did they work with magic?
There definitely was the concept of magic, the idea that certain people or types of people could have an ability to influence the world around them in different ways. A lot of it is going to be very similar, I think, to other cultures. Just that's the nature, in my opinion, before people start, yelling at me in the comments, in my opinion. Just the nature of magic, that it tends to be pragmatic in whatever culture we're looking at. So there's things focused on love. There's things focused on health. There's things focused on, success, protection, everything that would matter to a person, in their daily life. Yeah. In Ireland, of course, we're going to have more specific approaches to things and maybe specific ways to do things. But the ultimate point of everything, and a lot of times even the way they're approached, is very similar. So it's interesting to look at the way that we have things that are very general that you can look at any culture and find, and then also things that are very specific to Ireland. Like Irish magic tends to be very verbal. There's this idea of speaking things into being. They have a whole concept of what's called satire, and it's not satire in like the modern sense at all. And I try to stress that because I think people see the word and they immediately think of like how we would understand it today. And actually it was used as sort of, it's this spoken, almost like a curse kind of a thing, where you would insult the person. And the idea was that as long as you were speaking truthfully, they deserved to be satirized, basically. It would have negative effects on them. And there's, this idea in particular that it would cause like blemishes or disfigurements on the person as a sign that, they actually did deserve this satire. Obviously, it doesn't always work that way in stories because it's the nature of stories, but that was theoretically the intent behind it. And satirists were actually really feared in the sort of later conversion era culture. We have laws in the early Irish law tracts specifically about satire and satirists, and the idea that if you were making a satire unjustly, there were consequences for that. So yeah, just to kind of show you like where it was in the culture, it was a pretty significant thing. He also had something called a rosk, which is like a spoken poem, but it's magical in nature. So the idea was that you would speak this and then it would cause what you were speaking to happen. Sort of manifesting your will through this particular style of poetry. So things like that, I think, are more uniquely Irish. And then, of course, they had the idea of the evil eye, which every culture, I think, has some concept of that. That you can look at someone with ill intent and cause problems.
There'd be a use for that these days.
There'd be way too much of it going on, though.
Right, yeah, that's true.
It'd just be everywhere.
Because obviously fairies are very, very rooted in Ireland. Is there fairy magic? Is that a separate thing to general magic, or was there crossovers?
So I'm going to answer this two ways. Yes, there's an idea that the good folk themselves have a particular type of magic. And it's a kind of magic that generally humans don't have. Like, it's specific to them. It still influences things that like human magic would be aimed at, like health and luck and stuff like that. But good folk have a particular kind of energy, a particular magic to them. So because of that, there also were people who would specialize, not so much in the pre-Christian era that we know of, although I'm sure there were back then too, but particularly in the more modern era, there were people who would specialize just in knowing how to deal with fairies and fairy enchantments. So it kind of became like a magical subspecialty. Like if you were a wise woman or a cunning man or, what have you, you would know how to deal with like all sorts of different kinds of magic and potentially magic things, but you would particularly know how to counteract certain activities by the good folk. If they were targeting someone, if they were causing someone problems or enchanting them or anything along those lines, you would know how to deal with that because it was sort of a specialty field.
Now I'm going to jump back to where you mentioned the deities list and the other spirits. Why a separation? What's the difference?
So in a lot of ways, it is an artificial separation. It's a very fair question. When we look at Ireland, there is sort of an understanding that there are humans and then there are non-human spirits. And I'm really simplifying this. There's a lot of nuance here that I'm just ignoring at the moment. Otherwise, this is going to be 2 hours of me just trying to answer this one question. When we look at the non-human spirits, we have different groupings with a lot of crossover between them. So it makes it very confusing. And when we talk about the Irish gods, we're generally talking about the Tuatha Dé Danann, one of the groups of powerful beings who settled Ireland before humans came there. And they are the ones who are the most often understood to be gods, and they're the ones in these older manuscripts and texts that are called gods explicitly. This is Manannan, the god of the sea, or, the Morgan is called a goddess, things like that. So we kind of approach it like we have the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old Irish gods, and then we have this sort of miscellaneous category. The Aishi, the fairies, would be included in that, which is such a messy concept because some of them are Tuatha Dé Danann, some of them are not. Like I said, there's really not a lot of firm lines here. I mostly broke it down just to make it easier for readers to kind of see the way things would get categorized, particularly in the pre-Christian period. So you have the Tuatha Dé Danann, you have the Aishi, the people of the Fairy Hills, who are referred to as a separate group in the mythology. They just aren't clearly separated. It's a lot of crossover. I'll use Manannan as another example. So he is a god of the sea. He is eventually included among the Tuatha Dé Danann, but he was not originally. And he was originally the god of the Otherworld, or at least, the majority of the Otherworld. So that's kind of how messy it gets. So he starts out connected to the good folk and to the Otherworld, and he's the king, and he's sort of this third factor in mythology with humans and the Tuatha Dé Danann. But then eventually he's sort of included among the Tuatha Dé Danann and is considered one of the Irish gods along with them. But that's not how it always was. And that actually really describes the majority of Irish mythology right there.
Okay.
It's confusing and messy and yeah. And then
like most family trees.
Yes. Oh, don't get me started on the family trees. Yeah. The genealogy of the Tuatha Dé Danann is slightly unhinged. Yeah. And then we also have beings like the kayak. The kayak may, emphasis on may, be one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Possibly. We don't know for certain. You have Dawn, who was supposedly, according to mythology, was the first human who died in Ireland. But he became kind of this ancestral god. All of the dead go to the House of Dawn. It's complicated. You have Crom Cruach, or Crom Dubh, who may or may not have been a literary invention originally. A lot of scholars think he probably was, because he doesn't appear in any stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He doesn't appear in any of like the original mythology stories. He kind of shows up later, and this is when we have to get that magnifying glass out in the later material. But he is pretty clearly coded as sort of a Antichrist, Moloch kind of biblical figure. Hence why most scholars feel that he probably was sort of a later addition to things. But he has still been considered a god for over 1,000 years. So he's definitely in there.
Earned it.
Yeah.
He's earned it by the sounds of it.
He's been treated that way for a long time. And there are certain holidays or times of year that are associated with him. You know, this is where I said it gets messy. It's all very messy. So yeah, and this is why I decided I would do the Tuatha Dé Danann in one section, and then sort of these other messier things in a separate section, instead of putting everything all together, because that makes it even more confusing.
Now, on to and I'm dreading pronouncing this, the Tales of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which is not how you pronounce it at all, which is your other book that's coming out later this year, Volume 1. What's this book all about, and what's the reason behind writing it?
Sure. I think this is a fun story. I'm not sure if everyone will agree with me, but we'll find out. So I started translating Old and Middle Irish a little over 10 years ago now, when I realized, as I was doing some research around the Morgan, looking at a particular manuscript story, that the two translations we have of that particular story, which were done about 100 years apart, there are certain points that are very different. And I started to wonder why that was. So I was looking into it and found out that that particular story, the Complexities, a lot of it had not even been translated. It was poetic material. None of the translators, including the modern ones, really wanted to try to mess with it, because it can sound very nonsensical in English, and a lot of it in the original language, you get a lot of wordplay happening that you just can't translate into English. And also the older translators, the stuff that's in the public domain that's easy to access, this would be the Victorian era, they would just ignore things that they felt were inappropriate for their audience, or they would add things in if they felt something needed to be clarified.
You've got to love the Victorians, bless them.
Yes. So I kind of realized that, we're approaching these English translations of these myths as if they are, basically holy writ. And I've seen people do this where they'll take a passage and just interpret like every single word for these deep spiritual meanings. And again, I'm not criticizing if that works for you, but I started to realize that is all based on one person's opinion when they translated it, and sometimes in ways that are very misleading. So I'll give you a quick example. You'll hear a lot of people talking about in Irish paganism, talking about Macha's acorn crop, being the heads of, warriors defeated in battle. And I have seen people who get very philosophical about the connection with acorns and oak trees and warriors and, one of Macha's symbols is the acorn or the oak. And I mean, it gets very elaborate and in depth. And the original text does not say acorn. It's a general term for any nut crop. It could have been any kind of nut. And right. And to me, that really changes the meaning. It could have been hazelnuts. It could have been anything. And if you're getting so in depth about, the symbolism of this particular thing, and then it turns out that's not even what was in the original story, the translator just used acorn because that was the easiest option, is really what it comes down to. And once I realized that, I was like, well, I clearly need to be able to read this myself, or it's gonna really annoy me. Yeah. So I had started learning Old and Middle Irish, and I started working on my own translations, and I had amassed sort of a body of this work. And Trevor Greenfield, who is the fabulous and amazing editor through Moonbooks.
All hail Trevor.
Indeed. I owe him like 100 muffin baskets at this point. He's
you and me both, probably.
Yeah. He is an amazing editor, and I adore him. And I am dyslexic, and he edits my manuscripts and has to deal with my very interesting approach to spelling sometimes, because spell check does not catch everything.
No.
So yes, bless Trevor for all eternity for putting up with me.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
He's amazing. But he had come to me and actually said that he thought it would be something that Moonbooks might be interested in, to publish these translations that I have done. And I initially was a little skeptical, because I'm like, well, I'm not sure how well that's going to work. They are popular. I do them on my Patreon. I have shared some publicly in the past, and I take a very literal approach to translation, and then leave it up to the reader to make it prettier or whatever you want to do with it. But so you can see, and I footnote everything. So you can see, like, these are the other ways you can interpret that word, in this instance. And that style apparently appeals to people. Some people like that.
I learned how to footnote my books from you. You are wholly responsible for any footnotes in my books. I didn't do them before I read your books.
Awesome. I love that. I'm a big fan of footnotes in general in books.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So yes, footnotes everywhere. That's cool. And yeah, talking with Trevor, he thought it would be a good idea. So I said that, why not? Let's try it. And Tales of the Tuatha Dé Danann Volume 1 is mostly shorter pieces that I've done that focus on either the Irish gods specifically, or the Aeshe, the fairies more generally. Because I think particularly for a pagan audience, there is this kind of desire to read these stories, to have access to them, but they can be a little hard to find. And often they're kind of mixed in or in amongst a range of other stories that might be less of a pagan interest. Try to say this as nicely as possible. There's just certain stories that people are more focused on if they're into Irish paganism. And so I tried to mostly do those. And like I said, initially it started because I wanted to know, what do these actually say? What is actually happening here? I do have Volume 2 coming out next year. And that one is fewer stories. It's actually a longer book, but longer stories. So the first one has quite a lot going on in it. Some of the Irish myths are fairly short. They might be a page or two worth of story. Others are longer. So the second book has longer material in it, including the Cathal, which I mentioned before. I have translated the entire thing start to finish. I do all the poetic bits. I 100% understand why other people do not, because they are a challenge. And I say right in the text that, there are places where in English this does not necessarily make a lot of sense, but these are the words, and you just have to sort of flow with them and get the wider concept that's being said. But the first one comes out at the end of October. I'm really excited for it. I hope it's going to do well. I love that Moon Books took it on because it is more on, I guess you would say, like the academic end of things.
Well, I say yes, but I think it's important if you're going to follow the Irish pathway, if you're going to study and look at these deities. For me, it's about going back to that source material. So I think it's really important.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And, part of why I did this, besides just spite against one particular Victorian era translator, Whitley Stokes and I have beef. Yes. So, but besides that, as a motivator, I wanted to make this material more accessible.
Yeah.
Because beyond even the language barrier, which is obviously going to be a problem for English speakers, even for Irish speakers, I should say, because Old and Middle Irish is not mutually intelligible with modern Irish. It's like Old and Middle English. Like, if you get late enough, you can start to understand a lot of it if you have modern Irish. But the earlier material, it's very different. The same way Old English is very different from modern English. So not only is there that aspect to it, but also a lot of these things, if you don't know exactly where to look to find them, you can't. And there's some material even, and I don't remember if I included anything in the first book. I know there's at least one piece in the second book that has not been translated into English at all. Occasionally you'll find things that have been translated into German, because there's a lot of there's a lot of interest.
That seems random.
It does. But yeah, there's a lot of interest by German language speakers, academics, in the Irish mythology. So there are certain things that were translated into German but not English. So if you speak German, that's useful. If you don't, then it's not. And you still have to know where to even go to find these things. Yeah. So part of my goal with all this was to collect things in one place, one book that people could go to. They're not retellings, because you can find those, but I think a lot of people don't realize how creative retellings are. You hear retelling and you think, okay, this is someone telling the story. But a lot of times it's that person really adding their own ideas and flourishes and filling out areas, all that kind of stuff. And not that any of that is bad, but people get this impression that was the original story, and very much not. So I'm hoping with this that people can go and see, this is the original story. This is what it actually says in the material we have written down. And then you can take it from there, do whatever you want with it. Sorry, I have a lot of passion about this.
No, but I think that's good. And I think it is really important. I think if you are going to work with any deity, you need to go back to the oldest source you can find and the most reliable source. The internet has so much misinformation on it. And so, like you were saying earlier, someone translates something, but it might be their own opinion, and then it just gets copied from place to place. The amount of time I've seen the same information, exactly the same information, with no base.
Yep. I run into that a lot.
So this is brilliant.
Yeah, when it comes to fairy material. And I need to do a YouTube video about this tonight. I haven't had time yet, but I have written multiple little articles and blogs and stuff where I'll run into something and someone will be like, well, there's this Irish fairy and it's called this. And I'll be like, I have never heard of that before, and I'm pretty well versed. I don't know everything, but I'm pretty familiar with like the range of stuff. And I'll dig into it and, oh no, this is coming from, one particular less than accurate author in the 1990s, or this is actually coming to us from Dungeons and Dragons. And
oh yes,
yeah, I run into that quite a bit.
I've had that from students. Yeah, I've had that from students. You Google a fairy, and the first thing that comes up
D&D.
happens to be Dungeons and Dragons, which is brilliant.
Yeah,
but not factually correct.
I love D&D. I have played it since I was a teenager. I love Changing the Lost. I love the White Wolf games. I love Vampire the Masquerade. All of that stuff, super fun. Not accurate to mythology or folklore. And yeah, the number of people that I've seen try to argue that cold iron is cold forged iron, because that's what D&D says it is. And that is not even close to what it is in folklore or, older belief. So yeah,
it's the dangers of Googling.
And especially now with AI. This is something I rant about a lot on social media, so brace yourself. Yes. A lot of people,
if you Google and it's the first thing that comes up, don't believe it.
Yeah, just skip right past that AI summary. Yep. And for two aspects of this, the AI takes, as you were just kind of saying, everything it can find. It does not differentiate between fiction, mythology, fan fiction, which is a whole other kettle of worms. It just takes everything, anything it finds, and it puts it all together, and then it repackages it for you. So you're getting material that a lot of it is not accurate at all to the question you're asking because of that. And also I've run into more and more people recently that use things like ChatGPT, large language models, as search engines, which is not what they are and not what they were designed for. Okay. And I think people
don't do it.
I think people are just not aware that if you ask something like ChatGPT to tell you about why the Morgan wears pink fuzzy leg warmers, the answer is not going to be that she doesn't. It's going to tell you what it thinks you want to hear. Yeah. So it'll give you this very creative, something.
I've now got the most horrendous vision. I really can. Yeah, she would not be happy with pink leg warmers. No, I can't believe that.
No. It might be an effective battle strategy, though. It would definitely throw your opponent off.
Distraction.
Yes. But yeah, I would just try to, throw out a very random example.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually, all of my books now, I've requested this through Moon, have a little disclaimer that nothing in the book was written by AI. Generative AI, of course. I do use spell check. As we've established, I have to use spell check.
Yes. So, there are some things that are useful. Yeah. Yes.
I'm not 100% against every possible type of AI. Obviously, spell check is great. I actually am not a fan of grammar checking programs, but that's me personally, because I find that they cause as many problems as they fix. Again, because they don't understand the dynamics of human language the way human speakers do. But I'm not criticizing that sort of, AI. Text to speech, if we would consider that AI, that's all fine. It's generative AI, where it is telling you what to write, or it's writing it for you, and then you're, adjusting it or whatever. I'm not a fan of any of that. So, and that's become a real problem in pagan publishing, not with pagan publishers, but with self-published material on sites like Amazon. There's an increasing number of books that are AI written that are horrifically inaccurate. Like I have read some things that I will never be able to get out of my brain again, coming from AI.
But because it's in a book, people think it is fact.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
It's frightening.
Yeah. Unfortunately, people assume, and I don't want to say it's a scam, but it kind of is a scam, but there's ways that this is done where it's not just like a person has AI write a book about the Morgan and then they publish it. it's done in such a way so they will intentionally make the sales look very high. They will pay for 5-star reviews. So you go on Amazon and you find this book and it's like, oh, this has, 100 5-star reviews raving about how amazing this book is and how great it is. And it's like in the top 10 Amazon sellers for that category. And actually it's an AI book and it's terrible information. But you don't know that until you get it. And if you don't know the subject at all, then you're going to think this is all accurate. So that's a big problem, I think.
If you're buying a book, check the author is a real person. And that's easy to do these days, isn't it? It is so easy to do.
Especially with pagan authors.
Just Google the author. Yes, we're out there. Yeah. You can't miss us.
Yeah, and there's other red flags because there are people who write under pseudonyms and you might not be able to find a lot of information about them. But if you have an author who is putting out a book every 2 or 3 days, which is something the AI people do and the content farm people do, if you have an author who has written 100 books on every conceivable pagan subjects, everything.
Definite red flag. Definite.
Yeah.
You and I write books quite quickly. Even we don't write 2 a week.
Yes, that is the joke that I'll usually tell people because I'm sort of known for being prolific and a fairly fast writer, but I cannot write, 2 or 3 books a week. I cannot write 1 book a week every single week. It just, you can't. And
no, there's ways to find out, isn't there?
And what I'll do now, especially on Amazon, is do the preview. And you can kind of tell most of the time, looking at that, whether a human wrote it or whether something weird is going on.
Yeah.
And don't listen to people that are like, look for M dashes and parentheses, because I love both of those things and you will find those in my books. And I am definitely a real person and I don't use AI. So, M dashes alone are not a sign that it's AI written.
Now, AI translating what you've just translated for your new book would be an interesting read.
Yes. It would be entertaining because even the Google Translate for Modern Irish is it's an adventure. And there is nothing, as far as I'm aware, that can translate Old and Middle Irish at all.
No.
So yeah, you would end up with some interesting things happening.
Nonsense.
Yeah.
Complete nonsense.
Yeah, for sure.
No, we went totally off a tangent there, but an important tangent.
Yeah. It's an important
Do
subject.
you think it is? Do you think that some of the stories, some of the myths are more important than others?
Do I personally think that? Yes. And I know people will disagree with me, but I think for an Irish pagan, it's important to look particularly at the mythological cycle. It's important to look at the stories where the Irish gods appear. And where I'm coming from with this, I realize this is actually a lot of reading material, but most people, in my experience, especially when they're first getting into Irish paganism or learning about it, tend to focus on just 1 or 2 main stories or myths. And not that won't give you some understanding of who these beings are, but a lot of times when you look at the wider picture, you look at sort of all of the stories they're showing up in, you find that things are a lot more complicated than they might appear in just that one story. So I certainly think everyone should read the Cath Moitura, the Céad Cath Moitura. So the second battle of Moitura is just called the Cath Moitura. The Céad Cath Moitura is the first battle of Moitura. And those are sort of 2 really important stories about the Tuatha Dé Danann and how they arrived in Ireland and, sort of who they are. But then there's a lot of other material out there that's also really important, that gives us some insight into who they are. If you want to understand who the good folk were, especially the older material, there's particular stories you want to look at that'll give you an idea. Because, for example, I see a lot of people talking about the fairies today, talking about how, fairies are only good and helpful and nice. And when we have bad experiences or we hear stories of bad experiences, that's Christian propaganda, trying to sort of make them look bad. And if you actually read the really old material, they're not portrayed as either good or bad. They are simply a group of human-like beings who are more powerful and more magical than humans and come from this separate reality. And sometimes they need our help, and sometimes they cause us a lot of problems. But you can kind of see that they were never just seen as like very nice, helpful beings. Even in the more positive stories, it's like, these are your neighbors. They're called good neighbors in Scotland, actually. But these are your neighbors, but they're not your human neighbors. And, you just kind of need to be careful that you are on good terms with them and, as much as possible and things like that. And I think it helps dispel the idea that, which is also coming from the more New Age end of things, that they are just here to like help humans. They just want humans to be better humans. And no, some of them like us, some of them don't like us, and some of them wish that we were not here. So, it's a variety.
Now, it's huge subject, and we've literally just touched the tip of the iceberg there, and it has been fascinating. So read the books if you want to know more. Are you working? This is a silly question again. Are you working on any new projects?
Always. I always try to keep busy. I do have three books already scheduled for next year. It shows you how much I work that I can't even remember how many books I already have coming out. In 2026, I have a book on the Scottish fairy courts, and how they evolved into the modern concepts of the fairy courts, which I think people will really like. I think it's a great subject, and certainly one there's a lot of misinformation. I have a Pagan Portals about the Wild Hunt coming out next year.
Yes, looking forward to that one.
Yeah, that's a funny one. A friend of mine, actually, I was talking to her about how I don't know what else I could even write about at this point. I've covered which I always say when I'm getting, I go through phases. And she was the one that was like, you should write about the Wild Hunt. And I was like, huh, okay. I wonder if people will be interested. And every time I mention it, everyone is like,
definitely
very interested. So thank you, Allison, if you're listening. Good suggestion. Yeah, and then I have my second translation book coming out next year as well. The first one comes out in September. The second one is out, I believe, next July. And hopefully, in a perfect world, those will both sell really well, because I am currently finishing up a translation of the Tangled, which is sort of the big Irish epic with Cuchulainn, and there's a lot of Morgan going on in there, and some Lugh, and lots of really interesting things. But obviously, if the first two translation books do not find an audience, then the third one, that the Tangled won't go through with Moon, which I'm hoping it will. So
buy the books, people. Buy the books.
Just keep in mind, if you want more, you do have to buy them.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. It's all absolutely fascinating, as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Yes, people, get out there, buy the books.
If you want literal translations of Irish myths, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, you know where to go. Thank you so much. Thank to everyone that's listening and watching, and we'll join you all again next time on the Pagan Portal Podcast.
You have been listening to the Pagan Portal Podcast, a Moonbooks Publishing production. For more information, please visit our website.